Now, this work started last year in SEMAT in March, in reality. This year in June, it was agreed that there would be a new standard based on SEMAT ideas. And that is, new standard will be taken in object management group, and the name of the new standard is a Foundation for Agile Creation and Enactment of Software Engineering Methods. It's a heavy title. Okay, well, you can of course sign up for SEMAT. Now, what is new? The kernel is new, and it's small kernel. Many have had kernels, but there's big kernels. One of the fundamental principles is the idea of separation of concerns. So we separate the practitioner's view from the methodologies. We don't really care so much about methodologies. We do it for the developers. In the old days, every other attempt had been designed for process engineers. And that's what we did with RUP. That's what we have done in other standardization efforts. We need to be light and agile with working with methods. There are a number of principles that support this agile. And it's very important that our, as I said, we focus on the practitioners. We need to have also remember about different levels of practitioners. Some practitioners don't really care so much about methods. Others really do, and we need to be able to support primarily the small group. Okay, focus on method use. That's very important. All our attempts like this have focused on being able to describe methods. That is process freaking. We focus on how to help people who use the methods. That's the key. Use method is more important than the other thing. All right, I will finish now. And just say that quote a friend of us, Woods Humphrey. He said, when we started this SEMAT, he said, basically he said in little paraphrasing it, is that this is the biggest step that's happened in 40 years in software engineering. It could very well be the biggest step that's happened in 40 years in software engineering. So that's where I think we are.
Ivar told me that if you overruns, I'm to stop. I couldn't bring myself to do it. You overran a minute or two. Could we take one question for him before we move on to the next speaker? Okay, we're going to save the questions for Ian.
Okay.
So our next speaker is Ian Spence. Ian's going to talk about the kernel. Ian is Chief Technology Officer at IJI, and he's been leading the kernel track, which I've been participating in for 2 years, so I feel like I know Ian pretty well. In fact, we try to find time when we can get everyone together that's on the track, because people are around the world, and people have busy schedules, so what we found is we meet on Sundays frequently. So, and frequently, I know a secret about Ian. He shared it with me that sometimes he actually is still in his pajamas when I call on Skype on Sunday morning. And another interesting thing about this is that
Paul had his webcam on and appeared to be naked.
He didn't catch me. I got off my treadmill and I was still sweating, and we had to get the Skype going. And I had my he had that webcam accidentally was on, and he's going, "Put the shirt on. I can't watch this." So Mira has made a point though too about our buddy Ian, that she tells me that every time she's doing it now, she's laughing. He really makes her laugh. I don't think it's got anything to do. She gets smiley face here. She likes not to do with, she's been there with the pajamas. It's happening now. But it's got to do, watch his face. Just watch it, he'll start smiling. He talks with a smile on his face. So let's give Ian a round of applause and give him a lot of that.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming along. As people have said, I'd like to tell you a bit about what this kernel idea actually is and the kind of benefits that you could get by adopting these ideas. So, let's go. So, a little bit of a recap. One of the major ideas and drivers behind here is to, as Ivar said, to liberate the practices. If you look at all the different methods that people have, they're made up of the same things. Okay, I mean, Ivar is famous for use cases, and use cases were in Objectory, they were in the Rational Unified Process, they were in the IBM method, they were in the catalysis process, and in hundreds of company processes. Okay, most of those processes aren't used anymore, but use cases are still, if you Google use cases, they're still the most popular requirements, elicitation, management technique in the world. Right? Huge number more times hits on Google than, say, for user stories. Right? So they started before with those processes and they're still going. A lot of the things we see becoming popular with agile methods aren't that new. They've been around for a long time. Right? And what happens is you can't get the good bits, can you? You can't get the good new bits without taking all of this other stuff you're supposed to have. Okay? You know, you might think, oh, I'd like to use use cases, but we're not iterative, so RUP wouldn't do. Well, you can use use cases with waterfall, any kind of method. And a practice is really just a repeatable approach to doing something with a specific purpose in mind. So it's a known way to solve a particular problem. And there are lots of practices. There's management practices, there's technical practices, there's social practices. And what people do in projects is they mix and match, don't they? And very few people in projects follow any particular method to the letter. And it's very constrictive if you do, isn't it? How are you going to get better if you're never allowed to try anything out? How are you going to get better if you can't bring in new practices, new techniques? And the idea is you can combine these practices together to give you your team, your organisation, a new and innovative way of working. You can mix them with explicit practices, with tacit practices. And this is what people are doing. If you go and visit any agile projects, they'll be using a mixture of stuff. They might have some Scrum, they might be using use cases, and other teams using user stories. They might be doing test-driven development, feature-driven development. And they're mixing and tuning and tailoring these things in flight. And in a practice, you'll find there will be the things you need to do. There's usually some kinds of descriptions of the things you need to do. So in Scrum, which Brian will be telling you a little bit about what Scrum would look like in this format, tells you to have daily stand-ups. That's something to do. Things to produce. There will usually be some work products. So in Scrum, you have to have your iteration backlog or your sprint backlog, etc. There'll be some competencies and skills. Things like, you have to have a Scrum Master if you're going to do Scrum. What does that mean? Any Scrum Masters here? Certified Scrum Masters? Did you stay awake for both days? That seems to be the test. I did. I was awake for both days. I got mine. And usually, a lot more people like guidelines and examples, isn't it? Right? So a practice would have a number of these components. And if you look at the industry, there are hundreds of practices. Some of them are in direct competition with each other. Okay, some of them are more sort of things like, use cases, user stories. There's things like component-based development. There's things like Scrum, iterative, and that often there are sort of extensions on those. You can have life cycles. You might use a unified process life cycle, or you might use a waterfall life cycle. You might have your own. There's governance in your organisation. You might have things about funding and decision making, change control boards. We see a lot of more social and cross-cutting type practices. You'll have QA, you might have review practices, or just things like having co-located teams all sitting together. Those things can be an important part of making your way of working work. So there's lots of them, and your way of working is really just a collection of practices. No matter where you've started or where you're going, that's what it will boil down to. And you'll find they're changing over time. Some practices, I've been doing software development for an awful long time now, Too long to think about. Do you remember punch cards? Me and Bruce did, don't you, Bruce? I used to do a lot of unit testing. Sort of, almost. We did test-driven development. Considering how long it took to compile, you had to do something while you were waiting. Unit testing seemed to go out of fashion. I can remember meeting graduates on projects, and they would say, this guy had a case statement, and he'd say, what, I have to test every case in the case statement? Surely one of them's enough. I had no idea, because unit testing had gone out of fashion. It's come back in with test-driven development. So some of them will last a very long time, others will come and go. No, they won't survive the test of time. Anyone doing waterfall development here? A few years ago, you all had your hands up. So your way of working is just a collection of these practices. And as your team grows and learns, as the team takes on new challenges, it will change over time. That's what you need. You want to keep up to date. You want to be using what the best fit. Your experiences will change, your programming languages, the challenges change, so it will evolve alongside you. And that needs to be something that we embrace. We don't resist, say, oh, we're not allowed to do that in this organisation. But wouldn't it be good if we could understand where it fitted in, how it